Well, welcome to SCI TV. I'm here with my colleague Ken Pendleton. I'm Joshua Gordon. Ken, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay, Josh. How are you?
I'm doing well. The uh, the weather here is typical Eugene weather, but what are we going to do?
Well, we'll have the long, hot summer soon, probably starting tomorrow.
So the what I was hoping to do today is dig into a case that's not exactly a current event in terms of recent headlines, but one that I think remains a current issue for the gentleman and the family involved, and really made headlines a little while ago. I was hoping you could summarize it. It's about Coach or former Coach Todd Hoffner, who was accused of something that, by all accounts, when I hear accusations of child abuse or sexual abuse, I have to admit I have a visceral reaction where I want to consider someone guilty for the issue of safety. And this is one of those situations. But can you give us a little more background about what was going on here?
Sure. Last August, Todd Hoffner, who was the coach at Mankato State in Minnesota, seemed to be more or less at the top of the Division II world he was coaching in. He had been very successful during his tenure. He had just received a 15% raise. He had expressed a desire to spend the rest of his career coaching at Mankato, and he seemingly didn't have a non-football world. Happy marriage, happy family, good stable career, no greater ambitions to move to D1 or something like that. In August, he was summarily suspended by the university and was not without explanation. And it turns out that the university had taken a cell phone to IT, and during that process, one of the people had discovered two videos of kids and his families who were the ages of 4, 8, and 9, who for 102 seconds were engaging in hijinks that was obviously being filmed by Hoffner, and the problem was they were nude. And so, quite rightly, the university turned this information over to the district attorney in the area, who concluded that this was more or less sufficient to conclude that he should be charged with child pornography. Hoffner never saw the videotape until he was actually charged. And to make a long story short, eventually the district attorney the court, not the district attorney, but the court dismissed the charges, saying that this was essentially playful hijinks between the children, that all the surrounding evidence, the testimony by the children, the explanation that Hoffner had given, his long-term, his history, which was completely clean, all suggested that once you put this in larger context, this was just a father filming his kids playing. And so I think at this point, Hoffner, as we're going to see in a second on the YouTube clip, thought that the end of this nightmare was over and that he would be restored to his position as head football coach at Mankato State. But as we're going to learn after we watch this video, that in fact has not been the case.
So by all accounts, Ken, there's no controversy here about whether or not there was actually child pornography happening or any kind of sexual abuse once the investigation was done. Is that correct?
Well, I should mention that the prosecutor has not dropped the charges. Now, whether that speaks to the fact that the prosecutor is not convinced of his innocence, or it speaks to the fact that prosecutors are really loath to drop charges for whatever reasons, such as an aura of invincibility or infallibility, I can't judge that. But the judge dismissed the charges before there was even a trial. In other words, he thought there was so little supporting evidence for this that he thought it would be unfair to even subject the person to a trial. It shouldn't even go to a jury. Right? And so there was a clear, and the judge clearly expressed his view that we weren't close to having sufficient evidence here to even bring the case to trial, and that the videotape could be interpreted in all sorts of ways outside of seeing it as child pornography.
So why don't we look at the clip? This clip is of November 30th, 2012, shortly after the judge made that judgment that said no issue here, really, right? And so seemingly this was the end of it at this point. So let's watch the statement I think it gives you a little insight into some of the emotion around it, and then let's pick up our conversation from there, if that sounds good to you.
Okay.
I've anticipated this day for a very long time. It has finally taken a person with great courage, authority, and common sense to see what these videos really are. Innocent and harmless family moments captured on a smartphone. The last 102 days have been long, painful, and a nightmare that my wife and I have had to endure. Our lives have been turned upside down. We have suffered considerable mental, physical, and emotional hardship. But today, our minds were filled with more questions than answers. Throughout this process, we have often wondered how this could have been handled differently, but more importantly, how can we prevent this from happening to another innocent family in the future? I am so thankful to live in a country where the presumption of innocence still means something. But I have been humbled by the power that a small group of people can bring to bear on an innocent person. I'm just so thankful to be waking up from this nightmare. In our society today, it is often difficult for people to do the right thing and to acknowledge that they have made a mistake. I'll be the first to let you know that I am sorry for using my cell phone to videotape some innocent and harmless family moments. I didn't think twice when I used that phone to capture 102 seconds of family moments. At the time, I just thought I was being a good dad. I was just doing what my kids asked me to do, videotape them at play. Ever since the story broke, my wife and I have been beneficiaries of supportive friends, parents, teachers, colleagues, administrators, coaches, civil leaders, and especially family. We are ever grateful for Jerry Mashka and Jim Fleming in representing my family and I. You have both been extremely supportive, professional, and first class throughout this difficult time. We are forever grateful and blessed to have acquired your excellent services. As our family continues through our journey of life, we will need a continuation of concerted effort to shelter my children from these false accusations. It will take a village to raise these children and to keep this nightmare from haunting them in the future. The adversity we have faced will only make us stronger. I'm going to leave you with a quote. Life is 10% of what happens to you and 90% how you respond to it. And that's from Lou Holt. On behalf of the Hoffners, thank you to all that supported us throughout this process. I'm really looking forward to getting back to my life, my job, and my family. Thank you.
So Ken, what we have here is should be the end, right? I mean, what we're talking about is a statement expressing what a hard experience that he'd been through and really looking forward to getting back to his normal life. And this is in November. Can you add a little bit of the fact pattern of what happens after? Does he go back to his normal life? Does he go back to coaching? Is everything okay now that it's pretty clear that there was nothing of great concern here?
The quick answer is no. I mean, he had thought that this 102-day nightmare was over, and then, as he put it, he would get back to his family, his life, and his coaching. It turns out that he was able to, get back with his family, because in the sense that they're close and they have an experience that hopefully that they can, they'll be able to come to terms with, but in fact they're still not completely socially accepted within the community. So think, for example, if you were a parent, would you think about having another kid doing a sleepover at that house, even if you know the person is innocent, or even if you know that the court has dropped the case? More to our point, however, is he was not restored as the head football coach despite the success he had before, and despite being cleared. The university essentially assigned him an unrelated job where he was sort of banished to the hinterland, sort of an office that was largely detached from the rest of the university, where he had terrible cell phone coverage, and subsequently he's left Mankato State without, and then so I guess we could leave it to say, what is left of your life after something like that? And so he received criminal justice in the sense that the case wasn't even tried, but it's hard to see how in any way he's actually received restorative justice.
And so we're talking about here is the court of public opinion, and then also his employer and what responses they had afterwards. I have to say, if I think back on my own childhood, my mom had one of those old Super 8 cameras, and we had a lot worse than 102 seconds of footage that in today's day and age probably would have caused quite the uproar. And yeah, I don't think there was anything in there that was particularly concerning to me when I look back at it. And so what a small moment in your life to have that kind of impact and derailment. What I'm hoping we can do is kind of systematically go through this scenario and understand, and try and pick apart what's going here at a deeper level. So in particular, I'd like to start with some of the interests that are at play, because I think there are some very legitimate interests that are going on that should be supported, but then how do we do it effectively and balance the different concerns? So I'll kick it off, and then I'd love to have some of your input here, Ken.
Okay.
In particular, it's a legitimate interest for an organization and society to want to protect people from those that do bad things. In the post Jerry Sandusky era, it seems very easy to support the idea that we're going to err on the side of caution, right? That there's a strong interest here in making sure that our children are safe, that there aren't people doing horrible things and going undetected, and that we act and respond as organizations around that. And so it's not hard to immediately want to take action if you hear any hint of something around that. And yet, there are other interests at play here, aren't there?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think initially the school handled this the way they should. The person who was in IT saw the video, passed it up the supervisory chain. The people in the supervisory chain took it to the police took it to the DA. That's where I think things get complicated, because you could make a case that the DA should have probably investigated the case before pressing the charges, that i.e. should have interviewed Hoffner and tried to get the context around it before he decided whether to press charges or not. In fact, they didn't confront Hoffner till after. But then, once the case is the judge dismisses the case, it's I think the real issue becomes, how come there isn't restorative justice from the point of view of the university and from the point of view of the football team? It's interesting because the players adopted a motto during this process, and it was "flush it." And the point of this was, our focus needs to be on what we have to do on the field. And apparently, the new coach who was an assistant of Hoffner's was very successful, because they had a very successful season. They only lost 2 games, I believe, and so they sort of closed ranks institutionally, right? And so even after this ended, the question would become, does that team want to reintroduce this person who has been scandalized, even if they've been exonerated? And then from a university point of view, there was pushback as the process unfolded from some alum and some supporters of Hoffner. But at the same time, the university chose to essentially, to discontinue his relationship with the university and not give him any kind of restorative justice. And so I think it's interesting to think about why that is. Why didn't the university say, wow, the criminal justice system worked the way it should? They investigated the charges. They even filed the charges. But this, like Hoffner suggests in the press conference, this shows the system works. But in fact, the system didn't work because he doesn't get it. His life is still not the one he had before the incident, right? And so why didn't the university essentially restore him to where he was before? What are the institutional interests at play? And I think that's the really important question here.
Yeah, so I think that's spot on. So I think if you're looking at the institution and they're trying to protect their brand, their name, their students, right, all the folks involved in their community, there's very little upside for them in actually spending their energy trying to make right by this one individual. No matter how much they may have been wrong in the initial assumptions about what was happening here, there isn't much upside for them to then bring him back into the fold. What if 2 years later he does do something wrong after they brought him back in the fold? Shouldn't they have acted and gotten rid of this bad evildoer at that point? Right? There's this kind of framing where there's very little upside for them to bring him back into the fold, and yet all the incentives institutionally in the world to try and figure out how to just move on, move away from it, move to the next person. If you look at interests about having a successful football team, well, they found a capable replacement coach in his assistant who was doing a very good job. The team had bonded around that. How do you reintegrate someone who's been through this experience? How do you keep the media circus from happening? All of these reasons, they feel legitimate, and yet the end result of pursuing these legitimate organizational interests is this gentleman who's been incredibly harmed and may never be right again, professionally or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the ironies of this case is that Hoffner would have been better off had he been at, say, the University of Minnesota, right? If he had had that kind of success at a Division I school, especially one in a major conference, but I would argue any Division I school, he would, even if he wasn't restored to his job after an incident like this, he would be marketable because those universities have to put such a premium on success on the field. Any coach who can do as well as he did, who had been exonerated, would find a job. But at the Division II level, where winning is just one of a plurality of goals, which we normally think is as being a more healthy approach to what what sports should be, what college athletics especially should be. He's actually worse off because what they think, first of all, the guy who replaced him was just as successful as he in his trial under fire. Second, as you point out, the pluses of him doing, the pluses are just he could do as well as the guy who replaced him did, or maybe we think he would do better, slightly better than that guy over the long term, or have a better probability of doing well. But the downsides are potentially catastrophic. So if he was implicated in another incident, you can only imagine the legal liability involved in that. Also, whenever he meets with boosters and alum and goes to events, there's always this cloud, right? It never fully goes away, and it is this defining incident in his life that it's going to be very hard for people not to actually cognize or think about, even if intellectually they know they shouldn't do that. It's nonetheless something that's always going to, is possibly going to be there that the university then has to worry about. So from an institutional, I think it seems like a very rational decision. The problem is, from a human point of view, Hoffner essentially was thrown under the bus. And so I think we really need to think about what constructive steps could be taken in the future to address that. One that occurs to me is the university should actually just think about compensating him and making sure he's set up with a proper pension, realizing the horrible position he is being put in. And I know that a small university doesn't want to have to think about laying out that kind of money over an extended period of time because Hoffner is very young. But it's the right thing to do. And universities aren't supposed to just be here to think about it in terms of how do we maximize narrow institutional goals. Collegiality demands that you do what's right by the people involved and that you don't throw them under the bus. And so I really think they should at least take some restorative steps towards him.
So I hear you in terms of the monetary restoration, but if you think about, if this is a guy who loved showing up at the football field every day, his identity was so enmeshed around being part of this football team, in having the identity that he envisioned himself there for another 20 or 30 years, that this was really part of who he was, his community and everything else, I don't know how those interests get met by financial restitution.
No, I don't think they will be. I'm not pretending that my solution is an ideal solution. I'm suggesting that at least trying to compensate him financially is a step in the right direction. I would think the university should do everything in its power to say, to other institutions that might consider hiring him, look, this guy never had a single problem. This guy's been a good citizen. This was a terrible thing that occurred. If he came to your institution, he's not going to have the same social baggage he would have at our institution. They could take all those steps, but the prospective institution that would consider hiring him might say, why would we want to hire someone who has this, this sort of strike against him, however unfair it is? Right? And again, the irony is the only exception I could see is if he was at the Division I level and he won as much as he had at the Division II level, some athletic director instead of boosters would say, look, let's hire this guy. He didn't do anything wrong, and he can really help us have a successful football program. But at a Division II level, the priorities, which we normally think of as more healthy, actually work against him being rehired, either by his institution or by another institution.
And I would add that I think there's such a different kind of reaction when it involves something around sexual allegations in children, and that I don't know, is there a precedent even at the Division I level of someone having that type of allegation and then coming back to a career that is fruitful?
No, I mean, not that I know of. At the Division I level, the worst thing that might happen to a coach is, a DUI or being involved in an assault, like Coach Bobby Knight was when he was at Indiana, when he was coaching the U.S. national team in Puerto Rico. Right, those don't. Even if that's something we would see as unsavory and something that should have nothing to do with being a collegiate, amounts to a collegiate instructor, a coach or a professor, whatever you want to call it. Nonetheless, it doesn't touch a nerve in the same way that a charge of child pornography does. And again, that sort of really speaks to the kind of cloud you're always going to be under, even if you're cleared by the court of law, right? And the only thing that Hoffner could hope is that this, that as time goes by, this sort of fades from people's memories, and that I hope for his sake that he gets a chance to coach again, because it's what he was and who he was, and he was that rare individual who got to do something for a living that they were completely enjoyed being immersed in, and that's really the saddest part from a life point of view.
Yeah, I think we've seen a few stories in the past year, and I think if you dig deeper, there are a lot more about people who've been wrongly accused. And it's funny to me because in a lot of ways, I shy away, even from a practice area, of trying to immerse myself around those folks who have been wrongly accused, because what if I find myself advocating for or being part of furthering someone who is a wrongdoer, someone who's done bad acts and tricked us into thinking they were wrongly accused. That hint of that small chance that someone might actually be what we thought they were is scary enough to keep most of us away. And so when we look at the structures that are in place, Ken, can we take a few moments and think about, are there any structures that can be put in place to create a bit of a safety net around this beyond the judicial system? So the judicial system seems to have a pretty good check and balance to most often not put people wrongly behind bars, but the collateral damage for them in the court of public opinion and what kind of happens from there, the whole snowball effect that we've seen for Hoffner and for others. We look at Brian Banks, we look at others who have had all kinds of issues. There's even a website now, Ken, that tracks daily stories of people who are wrongly accused. Now, maybe a couple of those are not wrongly accused, but you just don't know. And from a structure standpoint, we have all these mechanisms in place to try and ensure safety, and some of them fail even from time to time. But what about then mechanisms in place that do some of that restorative work that you were talking about?
I'm open to ideas, and I think we can explain why the institution is reluctant to do this. We already have, but how can what steps could be taken do, to get people to do this beyond trying to appeal to their goodwill and conscience, try to get them to be aware that you are effectively even throwing this individual under a bus, right? And at a university especially, that should be something that is considered to be absolutely unacceptable from an ethical point of view. Right? And so let's say, for example, the university decided they would have joined Hoffner at this press conference and said, we feel like we acted right procedurally, but we are most relieved that in our legal system showed that there was no, that ultimately there was no basis for these charges. Well, if they did that, if they actually joined him at that press conference, well, then how could they argue for not hiring him back? Right? How could they defend shunting him off to an obscure part of the university? Right? And so the institutions are almost designed in such a way that they're inevitably callous to the interests of those individuals in them. And so I would love to think about how we can get them to be less callous, but beyond appealing to the conscience of, say, the president of the university, the athletic directors, the trustees, the prominent alum, I'm short of ideas on how we can do that.
Yeah, it's funny. We talk a lot about the importance of gathering good data when a conflict breaks out. And here, where you did all the steps right, you launched an investigation. You really tried to figure out what it was that was happening, get good information, got to the point where they had good information, and then you would hope that would inform the action from there. But by all accounts, the actions that happened at that point don't line up with the information that what happened. And so there's a disconnect between the data that said, here's a guy who did not do a bad act. We thought he did, but he did not. And then the subsequent actions where you have a guy working in a shed until they can figure out how to legally fire him.
Yeah. If I was going to point blame, but initially, again, I have to come back to the DA. I think if the DA had done due diligence before the charges were pressed, and actually done interviews, gotten the context, got the social worker interviews, then the university wouldn't have felt a need to take this action. Right? They could have internally suspended him for reasons that no one would have needed to know about, and then when the suspension was lifted, I think they would have felt freer to restore him to his position. But once the DA decided to go forward with the charges, then the cat was well and truly out of the bag. Or maybe I should use the analogy, the genie was well and truly out of the bottle, and it's very hard to put it back in. Right? That now there was this aura around this that is simply not going to be, it's going to be very hard for Mankato State as an institution to address retroactively.
So, Ken, one test I like to put to conflict is the how do you sleep at night test, right? I think really what we're talking about here is values. And so for those folks who are in the decision-making process, once they realize that you have an innocent person who had done nothing more than do his job well, and really the biggest act is one we probably all do, which is take a piece of university-owned phone equipment and film it for personal use, right? I mean, that's really the bad act that was here. I think, if you think about all the things people do, personal phone calls on the phone and emails and all the other things, I think just about anyone could be fired for those things. And how do people sleep at night? I mean, I think we're talking about a values issue. Where is it that justification or the core values of people then feel okay, show up at work the next day knowing that you have an individual who's toiling about in horrible pain probably to this day? What do you think about in terms of some of those issues?
Well, on an ethical level, I don't think that we define ourselves by our moral dignity or, just sort of the Platonic ideal. Plato goes so far as to say that if you do something wrong, the best thing that can happen to you is to be caught, because it's the only way you can possibly go forward, right? And so Kant, who argues that moral dignity is paramount, Plato, who argues that that you have to essentially be a good person to possibly be a happy person, may be right, but most people don't think that way, or don't think they're right, or have never, more to the point, haven't thought about the subject. And most people are really good at rationalizing that this is what I have to do. This is what my job entails. My responsibility is to serve this institutional interest. And if that entails that someone gets thrown under the bus, well, that I'm effectively have to be a utilitarian and do what's in the greatest good for the greatest number. And I think that might be really worth thinking about. How do you get people to, is there a way we can reframe the decisions where that all of a sudden that person's well-being is a more important part of the calculation, right? And that's one of the problems the larger institutions get. And Mankato State's a relatively small institution, but the larger institutions get, the more callous they are to those individuals, right? And the more the people who run them almost inevitably have to take a utilitarian, or do at least take a utilitarian standpoint towards their decision making. So I would appeal to them on a moral level and sort of say, you really owe it to yourselves to be aware of these institutional dynamics, right? And therefore don't throw someone under the bus. It's not the right thing to do. Apply the golden rule to it. How would you feel if that was done to you? And I guess I'd want to come back to the team and that flush it comment again, because football teams are, they want to focus on football, right? They want to focus on common interest of trying to win. They want to make sure their organization is structured in such a way that everybody's energy is going towards that. They don't want to deal with problems off the field, let alone one involving with a serious crime involving their head coach. But think of the lesson those players were taught at the end of this. If we take seriously the idea that college athletics is supposed to serve educational value, what those players essentially did, understandably, was circle the wagons. Not only during the process, but after the process, they essentially said, you're no longer part of our community. You're now outside of our community, right? Is that a good lesson to teach some these players who are going to get degrees and who are probably going to go on to professional and managerial jobs? The lesson they got out of this was, when something goes wrong, don't look at the bigger picture. Don't look at the larger justice of this issue in the lives of the individuals involved. Rather, you should focus on the narrow goal: making yourselves have a successful football team, winning as many games as possible, right? And so everything pushes them in that direction, right? And so I think it's from the lesson these players got in the long run, I think is something I hope that they think about, and hopefully they reflect back on this and go, wow, was it really right that we didn't just restore Coach Hoffner to this job after all he had gone through? And if I'm a manager in the future for an insurance company or for a series of franchises, or am I going to be that way with my employees? Am I going to be that way with a customer who's wronged on something if I know it can be covered up? So I feel like you're really opening a door to what amounts to instrumental rationality, right? You assume a very narrow end, and then rather than an encompassing end, you look at it institutionally rather than thinking of it in terms of the individuals involved, and then you say, I'm going to now design everything we do towards furthering that narrow institutional end, rather than looking at an encompassing, taking an encompassing view of the problem that respects individuals. Right? And so I feel like the university at the minimum should try to open this up. If I was going to give advice to Mankato State, I'd say have a forum on ethics on how individuals relate to institutions, and invite philosophers, conflict resolution people, organizational psychologists, and really think about how you in the future could address an issue like this better.
I find this case really haunting. I went to law school because of issues of justice and the idea that you want to embrace a system that will come out with and support fair process, due process, and then good and just results on the other end. And certainly those interests of protecting children and protecting others are legitimate ones, and they need to be taken seriously. But once you've done that and you've exonerated someone, I have a really hard time in getting behind a system that then is okay with chewing up someone as collateral damage, because it's going to be uncomfortable to bring them back into the fold. You have to imagine that it would be really compelling to bring him back in, to re-embrace him and say, look, he's one of our community members. We took it seriously. he would have wanted us to take it seriously, given the charges, and he has no issue with that. But now we have to realize that now that we have the data before us, that there was no issue here, and we need to re-embrace him and restore him back to where he was. What we've discovered is our assistant coach is probably going to be a head coach somewhere else because he's great, and really try and just bring people back to where they deserve to be. And so I have a hard time in this one. This isn't a situation where we can comfortably walk away and apply a different standard and say, you know what, there's that shadow of doubt about this person and what their action was, that maybe the court system got it wrong, that controlled dialogue didn't allow for us to do a proper investigation. Here, by all accounts, the dialogue and the investigation got us to a very clear understanding that this was not a tip of the iceberg about bad behavior, but rather an individual who half-heartedly was filming his kids at their request while he was trying to watch football film. It's really hard in this situation to be okay with the result. And so we have the judicial process that acted seemingly appropriate, but then these other processes really violated the values that I personally would hold for a university. I imagine if the university stated its values, it would violate those values, and yet here we are.
Yeah, I think we really need to think about this in terms of understanding how the institutions function where this could have happened, addressing this, not only this specific problem that occurred with the coach, but probably their institutional processes in general in order to try to prevent things like this from occurring again. And my challenge, as I said in the previous comment, would be to Mankato State is at least try to, as an academic institution, not as an institution that's just training people for jobs, but as an academic institution, take this seriously as an ethical issue, and really try to examine what happened from beginning to end, what you did right, what you did wrong, how you would do things differently. And I feel like that that would be the right thing to do, to focus light on what, because to me the blame in all this has shifted. We now know the blame isn't Hoffner's. The blame is yours for not having addressed this problem in the proper way.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, people experience a cognitive dissonance when they put someone through a really horrible experience, and it creates this dissonance that they didn't deserve it. And in some ways, we have a pressure then to continue to paint them in a picture where in some way or somehow they are deserving of that process. And really, in some ways, we have to find a more nuanced conversation where we get to a point where we say, you know what, that was a painful and awful process. It was necessary to err on the side of caution. But now that we've gone through that process, we no longer have to be comfortable that that was a fair thing for him to go through. That now we can actually be more restorative by nature and apologetic and say, you know what, that is an experience you wouldn't wish upon anyone. And now we have to try and restore him back to where he was, because we did our safety concerns. We've alleviated those issues, and now we need to do something that's far more comprehensive and really more about what the mission of a university is about.
Yeah, no, I think that challenge is, to me, lies with Mankato State, or with maybe intercollegiate athletics and institutions more generally, because we really need to think about how can we make sure that institutions don't just trample people.
Yeah. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I think ending with the idea that institutions shouldn't trample over individuals is a good place to end.
All right. Well, with that, sign off until next time. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.